9 days from now, if Jesus hasn't come back yet, we are scheduled to hold an election. I love this country. I've followed politics for most of my life, but it feels like some things have changed since 2020. Maybe they haven't actually changed. Maybe just some of the darker side and the division of politics and parties has become more evident in the last few years. But in an election cycle, you will hear much about rights. Rights of access to voting centers and resources, and rights to possess dangerous substances and dangerous devices, and rights involving choice and pleasure, and rights to safety, and rights to demand a certain point of view, and a right to say whatever I want, and pretend that there are no restrictions that exist at all. What does a Christian do with rights? Christians are as likely as any group to demand rights that are self-serving. It's easy to draw up the issues and say Christians have to be on a certain side of the issue. And sometimes there's a clear right and wrong, but often there is much more at stake. Can we pause and remember that whatever happens in the election, that Jesus is still king? Last Christmas, almost a year ago, our series was called Come See the King. He came as a baby, and I hope over this election year, over 2024, that Jesus has become your king more and more than ever before. Maybe some of you need to make that decision to acknowledge that Jesus is your king for the first time, like a young man's going to do at the end of our service today. Jesus is in charge. We are his people. However we vote, Jesus is in charge, and we need to do what he says. So what does the Bible have to say about rights? Today we're going to begin a new series through just a couple of chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians. The series is called All Things. We're going to start in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you're using an old-fashioned paper Bible, it's easy to find. It's in the first half of your New Testament. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are long books, so just go towards about the middle of those two books. We're going to start in chapter 9. We just finished a series through the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippian church. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are letters from the Apostle Paul to another church in Greece. It's over 300 miles to the south of Philippi. And at this time, the population of that city would have been around 700,000, not that far off from population of the Treasure Valley. And it sits on a land bridge. And because it's between two seas, it actually has ports on both the Aegean and the Ionian seas. Port cities are cities of commerce, and they're also centers of sin, and the city of Corinth has it coming in from both directions in the middle of Greece. In Corinth, the people worshiped Aphrodite, and they worshiped Poseidon, and they also worshiped the emperor. There were lots of centers of temples where the primary commerce taking place at the temple was prostitution. The Greek historian Strabo says that the temple of Aphrodite in Corinth had over 1,000 prostitutes, and that brought in an awful lot of business. In the first century, to behave like a Corinthian meant to live an immoral life. Think of Dubai or Las Vegas. Lots of money, lots of commerce, lots of sin. Christian living in this city would be bombarded with messages about choice and about rights, about freedom to do whatever I want. Maybe there are some similarities between the city of Corinth and the Boise area, the Treasure Valley. We don't have the same level of crime as bigger cities, but we do have the same opportunities to choose, and even to choose sin, even if many of those choices are not public. But many of the choices we have are not between good and evil, but are choices for what is actually best. In that context, what does the Apostle Paul have to say about rights? The idea of rights and choice are closely connected, and Paul has something to say to Christians. So what are the choices that Christians face? And what are we to do about those choices? The examples may be different, but I believe that we can learn something from the Corinthians. Back in the book of Acts, we read about Paul spending time at the city of Philippi, and we just went through that letter. Later, he goes to the city of Athens. And then he's going to send Timothy and Silas back to Macedonia. That's where Philippi is. 2 weeks ago, we heard a little bit about this church and how they had supported the gospel financially. They had sent money to Paul to allow him to continue in ministry. And then Paul is going to go establish this church at Corinth, and it's one of only 2 churches where he spent over a year. The other was the church of Ephesus, and we also have a letter to that church. With all of that in mind, what I want to do this morning is I want to read a few verses from 1 Corinthians, mostly in chapter 9, and then make some application for how we view our rights. But I want to start with a couple of verses back in chapter 8. Because in chapter 8, there's been a question about eating food, eating certain kinds of meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And Paul has this to say about food in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 8. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. When Paul says that food is not an issue, that is a huge statement to a Jewish audience because so much of their laws are based around food, what to eat and what not to eat. He's saying that eating meat sacrificed to an idol may actually not be a big deal. Jesus has already said this. Back in Mark chapter 7, Jesus declared all foods clean, giving God's people the right to eat whatever they want without worrying about sinning. Paul says he actually declares that Christians have the right to eat such meat, but that right should not be abused. Church has wrestled with cultural issues, and it may not be meat sacrificed to idols, but over the years and over the centuries, we've wrestled with questions like, can a Christian watch an R-rated movie or play cards or go to a dance? Now, I'm going to make a clear division. If you're younger than me, you may have never considered those a question because you've seen Christian people do all of those things, and you've seen most of them happen in the church. If you're older than me, there may have been a time when those were absolutely forbidden in church. How do we decide about such issues? And I'm afraid the question is often limited to whether or not I can. Am I allowed? Do I have the right to engage in certain activities? These questions don't go far enough, and I think they actually miss the point. I want to spend some time today in the first half of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 in a culture that is surrounded by freedom of choice. What do Christians do, and why does it matter? As we jump into chapter 9, you're going to see Paul double down on this idea about food. You go down to verse 4. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Put yourself in first century Corinth. Do I, as a Christian, have the right to eat certain kinds of meat that others consider sinful? And the answer is a resounding yes. Clearly you do. Should I? That question is much more complicated. This week, my wife went to Ridley's. She bought meat that was on sale. 5 packages of meat she brought home, and she cooked me a very nice steak. And at no point did I sit and ponder, was this cow sacrificed to an idol, and am I allowed to eat this or not? No, I just enjoyed the steak. However, we have very real idols in our lives. And the issue that dominates 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think hits very close to home for us in the church. Because the main issue in 1 Corinthians 9 is about money and giving. An issue that came up in the book of Philippians. And again, there are some very clear principles drawn. I'm going to go out of order today. I invite you to go back and read this chapter all the way through later this afternoon or this week. But I want to skip ahead to the examples that Paul draws here, and then I will come back to the main point of the text. Verse 7 says this, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Don't get lost in the details. I want to examine these examples. First of all, soldiers' needs are provided. Soldiers have traditionally received GI, government-issued supplies. Your clothing, your gear is provided by the government. If you live on the base, you live in the barracks, you don't pay rent. You're provided with 3 meals a day. They may control what you wear and what you eat, but as a soldier, you don't have to pay for those things. The second example, a farmer gets a share of the produce. If you are working a vineyard that owns another, traditionally, you have had a right to benefit from the produce. My family had a farm for many generations. And in recent years, before that farm was sold, that farm was leased. It was rented to a farmer. And that farmer who raised the crop benefited from the produce of that crop, even though he didn't own the land. I have friends who are ranch hands in Montana. Some of them serve on a ranch that's over 10,000 acres. They don't own the land. They don't own the cattle. But all of them eat beef, because part of what they receive is a steer, is a beef that they get to partake in. Verse 8 says, this is not merely a practical matter. It is actually spelled out in the Old Testament law of God, where we read that even animals benefit from the produce. In the Old Testament world, when you harvest grain, that is threshed out by dragging a sled over the crops. The stalks and the heads are all together, and you drag a sled over them to separate it. That sled is pulled by an ox, and the book of Deuteronomy says that ox is allowed to eat some of the grain while he is working. And the Apostle Paul, in his many examples, says God cares more about us than he does about animals. He's actually going to give a fourth example about the Old Testament priest. Priests eat what is given to God. Jump down to verse 13. Do you not know that those who are employed in temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? Stick with me. In the Old Testament, you would come to the temple and you would bring sacrifices, often of meat or of grain. Sometimes you bring that sacrifice still on the hoof. You bring in a sheep or a bull. And the people that work in the temple, the priest would sacrifice that animal. They butcher it, they cook it on the altar. And then the priest gets to eat that food which has been set aside for God. All of these examples point to one thing. But can I back up for a minute? Remember, this conversation started with rights about eating meat that's sacrificed to idols. Paul says, I have the right to eat pretty much whatever I want. Don't say amen yet. But I will forego that right if it is a problem for someone else. The greater context here in chapter 9 is about a different kind of right, and I think this one will hit close to home. I'm going to back up to verse 5. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Paul's an apostle. He's traveling, spreading the word of God. Does he have the right to take along a wife and have her expenses covered? Well, the example he gives is James does this, and Peter does this, and it's not a problem. Paul is saying he can expect to be able to support a family by serving the gospel. Now, verse 6 sounds odd to us. Do Paul and his partner have the right to not work? Let me put it this way. I've been preaching at this church for the last year, but I have another job. that job prevents me from spending time with you, the people of this church. While I'm teaching classes throughout the week, I can't be spending time with you because I'm earning a living somewhere else. Stated a different way, if a preacher works another job, 40 or 50 hours a week, doing that to support his family, that same time cannot be given to the people of the church. What Paul is saying here is that he has a right to earn a living by working hard at sharing the gospel. Now, I'm very glad that there will be a new minister coming to serve this congregation. Paul's argument here is that he needs to be freed up to serve. I'm going to say it this way. I can say some things as the fill-in guy. You will never adequately pay a minister for services rendered. You can, however, free up a minister to serve. As a church, we provide ministers with a salary to free them up to serve the church. Not just do tasks, not just what happens on Sunday morning, but to serve the people who make up the church. Paul's making the argument ministers have that right. That is what it means when he says that he and Barnabas have the right to not work for a living. Now listen to how he summarizes it. Jump down to verse 11. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? In the same way the Lord commanded, in the same way Jesus said that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. This verse clearly summarizes a minister's right to be paid. I hope that you will continue to financially support this church, continue to financially support the ministers on staff at this church to free them up to minister, to serve. I hope that you will continue to give generously so that we can support missionaries, so that they can spend their time telling people about Jesus all around the world, like those who are visiting with us today. But most of us in this room don't serve in these roles. The conversation about rights applies to all who follow Christ. Has Paul clearly established that he has the right to get paid? I think the answer is yes. But what did he say about his right to eat whatever he wants? He said he's willing to give up that right for the sake of others. Like the freedom to eat meat that is sacrificed to idols. Like everything else that Paul talks about, he said he's willing to give up his right to a paycheck from the Corinthian church that he has been serving. Look at verse 12. If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. That's the central verse of this passage. Paul chose to serve the Corinthian church without receiving a paycheck from the Corinthian church. He chose that even though he earned the right. And we could learn much about how we approach our rights from this example. We're going to continue our discussion in chapter 9 next week, but will you allow me to draw some application from this text today? Volunteers give without being paid. You might say that volunteers give up their right to be paid because volunteers serve well and serve thoroughly around here. Volunteers are the heartbeat of this church. I love getting to work with the team that is the ministerial staff of this church. But volunteers make things happen. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. We've been without a worship minister on staff for several weeks. There's still musical worship happening because over a dozen volunteers are making that happen. And when we hire a worship minister, we're still going to need more volunteers to do that part of ministry. Jamie serves extremely well in kids ministry, but she has over 24 volunteers that are making that ministry run right now. And by the way, she would not say no to a dozen more that she needs and put into practice right now so that kids can be pointed to Jesus. I love the volunteers that have been serving over with students. And I love that there's been a group of college students that have kind of invaded to work with the middle schoolers and high schoolers and point them to Jesus. This week, I had one of my students volunteer to create the background slides, and other students were disappointed that they didn't get to do so. Volunteers are the heartbeat of this church, and they give up their right to be paid. There's a second application, comes at it from the other direction. Like missionaries that we support with your financial giving, Paul does receive pay from another church. If you jump over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that passage, by the way, begins with, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. We read this in verse 9. When I was with you, when I was with the Corinthian church, and I was in need, I did not burden anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. His whole point in chapter 9, he did not demand his right to be paid by the Corinthian church. So how did he live? Well, sometimes Paul worked an outside job, but that's not what he did here. He says he's able to do that because of the financial support of the Macedonian church. And if you were with us for the last few weeks, you know what church is in Macedon? The Philippian church, the church that he has thanked for their financial support of his ministry. By the way, last week here was a good giving week. And to that I say, thank you. But I also say, keep it up. There's more ministry to be done. Some of you are still wrestling with the challenge to start giving or to increase your giving so that more ministry can be done. This passage is all about giving up rights, and all of that is for the sake of the gospel because the gospel is more important than my rights. Go all the way down to verse 16. Listen to what he says. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity it is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Earning a living is so basic. And Paul put it behind telling people about Jesus. Maybe we can do the same thing with our rights over other issues. Verse 19 says this, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. 160 years ago, slavery was an issue in this country. And in the 1860s, decisions were being made. And Christian people who owned slaves were giving up their rights so that their human slaves could have basic human rights. That sounds so foreign to us. But not that long ago, that was a real issue facing Christian people. May I say that many of the things that we argue about over rights are actually similar? We have such a tendency to dehumanize people when we talk about our rights. And whenever someone receives rights, someone else has given up rights. Paul gives up his right to a paycheck from the Corinthians so that he can serve the Corinthians, so they can hear the gospel. Parents give up many of their freedoms so they can raise children. So for the Christian, who gives up rights? Not rights being taken, rights being given up. Go back and read through chapter 9. The rich give up their rights for the poor. The strong give up their rights for the weak. Go back and read through chapter 8. When we don't do so, it is actually a sin against Christ himself. I will restrict myself so that no one is prevented from hearing the gospel. Rights aren't taken from me. My rights are given up, and that will cost you much. So do you tend to demand your rights or give up your rights? Do you tend to demand rights for other people, or do you tend to get out of the way so you can point other people to Jesus? I think Paul is modeling with money what he teaches about all things, all matters of choice. And I invite you to wrestle with this week. I invite you to come back. We're going to talk about the rest of this chapter next week. Earlier in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 6, Paul says it this way: all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. And over the years, as I've read this passage from 1 Corinthians 9, as I've talked about the responsibility of Christians to give up their rights, Christian people have tended to get very hostile with me. How dare you suggest such a thing? Can I just say, I don't think I'm the one suggesting it. I think that's what the text says. I think that's what God is doing. I think we need to give up our rights for something more important. Go back to the book of Acts. Go back and listen through that series from April. Go back to Acts chapters 3, 4, and 5. The apostles, men like Peter, did not demand their right to preach the gospel. What they did instead was accept beatings so that they could keep telling people about Jesus. That's giving up, not demanding. Christians tend to demand their rights, and it's not the way to Jesus. The number of times in a given week I hear the words, "I can't," from mature Christian believers is amazing. And they tend to be phrased this way: I just can't. I just can't prevent myself from stepping in and taking care of this. I just can't possibly do it. I can't, much more often, I just can't prevent myself from speaking. I have to say something. It is absolutely necessary that I do so. I cannot resist that which Paul says he gives up by choice. Maybe we need to go back and read Philippians again, because I am indeed an unfinished project that God is still working on. A coworker said to me this week, maybe my right to freedom of speech includes choosing not to speak. A little bit hard for me. Maybe sometimes I need to choose not to speak, and I need to listen first so I can then point people to Jesus. Because it is about pointing people to Jesus, not about me being right. I will say it this way: this election for the Christian should not be about the right to say and do what I want, because freedom is not found there. Corinth is a city roughly the size of the Treasure Valley in population. But 2/3 of that population were slaves. And they understood it differently. We are called God's people. God owns us. Jesus is our king. We belong to him. That means my rights, even my basic rights, take a back seat to the message of Jesus. Because freedom is only found in submission to Jesus. Will you pray with me? Jesus, I take this time to acknowledge that you are King. And I confess to you that it is easier for me to sing those words than it is for me to live as if you are in charge and I will serve you. I pray for this body gathered in your name today, Lord Jesus. I pray that as we proclaim the name of Jesus, we will be willing to set our rights aside so that people can see you and you only. In your name, amen.